Hello and good morning, everybody. My name is Abby, and I will be your moderator this morning. I have with me today Danielle White of Myriad Advisor Solutions and John O'Connell of the Oasis Group. And today, these two tech experts will be discussing tech stacks for advisors. Before we get started, I want to encourage everybody to ask questions because there will be time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And now I will pass it off to John.
Thank you so much, Abby. I appreciate it. Hey, Danielle, how have you been?
Not so bad, John. How about yourself?
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're excited to have you. And, I think this is a hot topic, especially in the, RA market these days. And so I'm excited to dig in and help kind of lay some groundwork for people just getting started. So appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, why don't we dive right in? So we're going to talk we'll talk a little bit today about the tech stack. How do you create your initial tech stack? What should you be looking at? We work really with a lot of different REAs, independent broker dealers, and asset managers, and we work with the Myriad team when we work with some of those firms. And essentially, when people go out to create their first tech stack, one of the things that they really need to focus on is kind of which technologies do they need first, right? So a lot of people want to immediately jump into some of the specialty planning tools or kind of buy a lot of tools initially that they really may be overcomplicating their first portion of their rollout. So some of the things they really want to think about are, number one, you need a customer relationship management system. You need some place to capture leads and client information. And then you need to be able to have clients share that information with you via like a document management or document sharing capability. Some people use a portal for that. Some people use maybe a Citrix share file for that or SharePoint. But you've got to have some way for them to send you documents securely, like not via email, because they're going to be sending you things like their tax returns and their existing holding statements. So they need to send those somehow securely to you. Then you need some sort of proposal capability. With a lot of firms today, they're doing financial planning. So they're going to accept information from the client and create a financial plan, and that will be their initial proposal to talk to the client over. And then once the client says, yay, I love you and I want to work with you, then you need some place to be able to put, to open their accounts and start that process. So in an investment portfolio management solution where you can do digital account opening or just do open the accounts, you can accept the money to be able to fund the accounts and then ultimately create the investments. Those accounts are going to open up on a custodian platform. So you need to figure out which custodian platform you want to use, or if you go multi-custodian. Normally, I wouldn't recommend going multi-custodian until you get to a decent size because you're going to have twice the amount of back office learning that needs to happen when you're multi-custodian. And then finally, you need to do some sort of performance reporting so you can turn around and be ready for an annual meeting with the client and to say to them, this is the performance of your accounts, your household, and each one of your clients. Do you see the same thing? Do you see a lot of people kind of overcomplicating it at the beginning, or maybe they're just breaking away and not doing as much?
Yeah, from our viewpoint, where we see a lot of people get into trouble is, their eyes are bigger than their stomach, so to speak. And so they try and go out and see what's all like cool and new and things that they haven't been able to utilize, maybe more in the captured environment or those IBD markets. And so they are just excited to get out there and see what they're able to use and utilize, and then they might overbuy. And so one of the first things we do is kind of tell them to slow down a little bit, look at things more from feasibility, not only just for support within the practice, but just like your budget or usability. And then even just for future growth aspects, another area that I see people make mistakes is on the scalability front, or if you're wanting to change providers down the road, like who owns the data and how hard is it to actually like get out of those things. I don't know if you've come across that in kind of your realm of the consulting world, but those are areas that we see a lot of bumps and hurdles right out the gate.
We definitely have, especially when you start thinking of, all right, so you've broken away, or maybe you're standing up your firm from the beginning, right? Um, you've got to be able, if you're breaking away, you've got to be able to get your performance data and your existing CRM data, and then you've got to import that into whatever new tool that you're using, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes, a lot of times, people underestimate the amount of effort it's going to be to get that data, massage it so that it can get into the new tool, and then actually get it into the new tool.
Yep.
So, and in some cases, performance reporting solution providers are going to charge you for data that you're going to import into the system. Or, for example, even if you're changing, archiving solutions, there are some vendors that will charge you to get your data back out of their archiving solution.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, that's something that's always overlooked. I feel like it's not a question that gets asked, out the gate typically.
absolutely. And like you said, I think a little bit of planning can really help in that respect.
Yeah, one area that we always try and help people, which it seems that they mostly think of it in the realm of like repapering or getting their accounts moved, but not necessarily in the fintech space, is, the old adage of garbage in, garbage out. Like your data is only as good as the data. Like it's whatever you're inputting into the system, that's as good as it's going to be in the new system. So you can get new systems, you can get new platforms, but if your data is junk, the systems are still going to be junk.
Absolutely. We find that a lot too with client names or household names, right?
Yes.
Sometimes it's the Danielle White household, right? Or it might be the John and Suzanne O'Connell household. So it's not consistent. And one of the challenges you get is if you're migrating data, that inconsistency in your actual data is going to cause you a ton of challenges, both in the migration and, like you said, garbage in, garbage out. Take the opportunity to clean up that data as you're doing the migration, because that'll probably be one of your best times to clean it up, and you can do it in bulk, right?
Yeah.
So you can actually change it and say, I want it to be last name, comma, first name all the time. Much easier to do that with exported data than trying to do that through a front end where you have an army of people going in to fix one record at a time.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, in the relation of these technology solutions, do you find that people fight you, for lack of better terms, on which one is kind of the initial app that is utilized in the workflow? I feel like when we talk with a lot of the tech providers, they always want their system or platform to be the first entry into the workflow. And so just if you could talk to me a little bit about how you migrate that with your clients.
No, you're absolutely right. A lot of the fintech providers, especially in the wealth management space, are going to say, well, we start with my application. And what I like to do is bring our customer, which would be the RA or IBD, back to the beginning, right? No one starts their conversation with a client around investment management necessarily. We're going to initiate a conversation. We're going to meet one another, like at a cocktail event or maybe an art museum event or your referral, right? We're going to get introduced somehow in many cases to one another. Or maybe I'm even just cold calling, reaching out to you. At that time, I really don't know much other than your email, your phone number, and your name, right? I may go out to LinkedIn or other areas to gather demographic data about you before I get on the phone with you, which is a best practice, by the way, as opposed to getting on the phone and going, so Danielle, tell me about yourself. So when you're doing that and gathering that information, I like to look at it as a sales cycle. The first place you start really is kind of a CRM, right? And then, the order that I have this in is actually not surprising, right? I start with a CRM, then you're going to send me a bunch of stuff. And then I've got to put that someplace, because I may not be the only person looking at it. My operations team may look at it. I may have a specialized financial planner that's looking at it. So I'm going to get your stuff somehow. I got to have that in a document management system so that the rest of my team can look at that other than email. And then I've got to be able to sit down and do a financial plan for you and say, this is what you're in today. This is what you can be in tomorrow. And here's the reasons why we would recommend that for you. That's your financial planning. And then it kind of flows through what I would call the wealth client journey, to basically walk someone through that wealth client journey. So I do agree with you. A lot of times people say, well, let me move my performance reporting first. Don't do that, because you really need to get your sales process running, because that's the engine that feeds your business. The rest of it you can do later on. Even when we do performance reporting, a lot of times we recommend to firms, turn on your new performance reporting system, let that run for a couple of weeks, where you're getting that daily start of day file, and then migrate the history in. Because if you try to migrate the history and then turn it on and something goes wrong, you're going to wind up re-migrating the history anyway. So
Yeah.
turn it on, let it run a little bit, migrate your history, and then you're off to the races. But I agree. There are a lot of times firms will say, well, just migrate everything and let's turn it on. Well, no, let's turn it on first, and then let's migrate everything and see if it all works.
Yeah. Can you talk to me, a little bit more about that workflow and, if clients even are aware of what their actual workflow is in the realm of a fintech performance, I guess, through all of these platforms, or how you work through helping them identify that?
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, again, we come back to that wealth client journey. And I think we're a little bit unique in the way that we work with clients around that. So we sit down with them and say, okay, you've been introduced to someone, or you've gotten a referral. Let's talk about, how do you handle that lead? That will typically occur in their CRM, right? That workflow will typically exist in their CRM. And then at some point you get through those and you say, okay, you've presented, you've gotten to a point where they've given you information, you're going to generate a financial plan. What does that workflow look like? That may still live in the CRM, because it's a lot of task-oriented things that can live in the CRM. Once the client says yes, and you're going to IPS them and then move to digital account opening or just account opening, now you're outside of the CRM, right? So as many CRMs in the marketplace today say, well, our workflow can handle your entire business. That's often not the case, because there are a lot of steps that you need to go through. Just think of OFAC, right? Or maybe you have someone that fails to be able to open up the account, right? So they NIGO on the account, and you've got to get additional information from them. A lot of times that happens with name changes. Maybe someone got married, their existing 401k was in their maiden name and it's not in their new name, so they fail a SIP check, and now you've got to go through a SIP check. So those types of processes, a lot of times they're written down in Excel files, or we have some firms that have sent us literally OneNote notebooks that have all the steps that need to happen, or it's tribal knowledge. It's actually in the operations leader's head to know what to do. That's where we find it pretty challenging. We've got to get that out of these other areas, get it so that you've got a map of the workflow. And then once you've got that map, you can then either automate that, or you can at least have it in a piece of software to provide visibility across that workflow. But there are a lot of firms that struggle with that. They don't have their workflows modeled today, or they're modeled very incompletely, and you've got to basically help them fill in those gaps so that you can actually find software that does what they want it to do.
Yeah, we find that pretty frequently as well. And, it lends into another area where we're able to assist clients and just the whole disaster recovery aspect, because you don't think through, oh, we're doing this day in and day out, I better have this written down or documented somewhere, because if John, gets hit by a bus, hopefully that doesn't happen, somebody else can step in and help out. So, I think that's a huge focal point in the industry right now, is just in the whole disaster recovery kind of succession plan piece. But it is so critical and important at the beginning stages. So you may have your firm and you may be taking the leap into further independence, but there's so many piece parts that are crucial in that foundational aspect for you to scale and grow and make this transition as smooth as possible.
Exactly. And who to call in the DRP, right? In the disaster recovery plan. So you have a disaster recovery plan, that's great. So let's say you're reliant upon a specific piece of technology. Maybe it's your CRM, or maybe it's your investment management technology. If you all of a sudden are locked out of that, who do you call?
Yeah.
right? So we've run into situations where like, well, you can click on the button in the software and just open up a support ticket. That's great, but what if you're locked out of the software?
Yeah.
You can't click on the button in the software then to initiate a chat or open up a support ticket. Who do you call to do that? And in a
It's
lot of cases, they
probably,
don't have that written down.
yeah, it's probably the Ghostbusters, because every time you said who you gonna call, it's just what I thought. So
That's right. Well, I've got an Ecto One right over there on my shelf. So,
no,
but
actually,
you're absolutely right.
don't call the Ghostbusters. Don't do that. I won't. Yeah, no, I agree. It's there's so many things that get overlooked in just business operational sense. It doesn't even have to be a financial firm. You know, we've dealt with it. We're business owners here, and you know, we've probably seen most of the things that do go wrong in starting a business, running a business, selling a business. And so, you know, people like us, toot our own horns here a little, we're here to help navigate those areas and make sure people aren't making the same mistakes, or that they're even aware of what mistakes they could potentially make. I think that's the biggest aspect in making this move or change, is just even knowing what decisions you have to make, and then how important are those decisions in your future success.
I completely agree with you. You know, and it's interesting, right? Because that kind of, if I can, that kind of brings us to this next piece, if you will. You know, when you start, like certainly when we start thinking about how to build a really successful tech stack, you know, we've already talked a little bit about the don't boil the ocean, right? Start small, do something that's going to be successful. But you brought up a really interesting point that I think really talks pretty succinctly to these next two bullet points. You've got to have really well-defined goals for the technology transformation project or the new technology stack, and then you've got to publish them so you can stick to them. Because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times without that written down of what do we really want to accomplish with this project, you can watch the scope of that project creep larger and larger and larger to the point where either A, it'll be one of those large engagements that we all hear about that is unsuccessful, or
Yeah.
B, it's the never-ending project, right? And you can't claim victory or cross a finish line, so nobody feels like it's actually done, and that's what really undermines the credibility of whatever you're rolling out.
Yeah, accountability is huge, just as the initial goal, really. And then for taking a step back, what have you, in beginning this process, you know, when you look out there in the ecosystem, you know, we see it out at the conferences, or just even get on the internet and Google what's out there. It is so vast. So, how do you recommend people even start evaluating those different firms, or what is best for them? Because, you know, just because somebody has the name and the recognition and the brand and they're at every conference doesn't necessarily mean that they are a good fit for the smaller firm or the boutique firm. So, you know, where do you begin, I guess?
I think the first thing I think you want to do is get prepared, right up front. So you've got to identify the most important requirements and then the applications that you need. For example, um, we've got some firms that we've worked with that are struggling with, they've got plenty of referrals, they got more than enough business. They're struggling with their mid and back office operations, right? How do I propose to a client? So how do I get my financial planning done in a timely manner? How do I make sure I'm gathering all the documents that I need in one fell swoop, as opposed to I keep going back to the client asking for more info, more info, more info, right? So that can be solved really easily with things like a checklist. What do you need for a financial planning checklist? Then you can provide that to the client and say, could you go off and help me get these documents from you? Here's a secure way for you to share them, and then we can go off and do a financial plan. On the back office side, it's again, either A, not having a really solid checklist, or B, where you don't have those processes written down and you've got to write them down. We recommend start with one area that you want to get the biggest bang for the buck and really deep dive on that to be able to get a good set of requirements together. If you can identify the application or the business process that is causing your firm the most pain, then you can focus. That's going to be one of the first things that you want to implement or you want to tackle, right? Focus on getting the requirements around that. Document the business process that exists today around that. Document the problems with the business process as it exists today, right? And then that's going to give you a very solid set of requirements that you need. Then go out and look at who are the vendors that are in this space that can do this. Don't get a generic demo from those vendors. You know, and I joke all the time, I have never met a technology salesperson that has given you a bad demo unless they were sick. If they're sick, give them a mulligan. They're probably going to give you a bad demo. But if they're not sick, you're going to see everything looks great. Everything looks like it integrates. The workflows look fantastic. You know, most of the technology out there looks really good. Can it satisfy your requirements though? So our recommendation is once you've gotten your requirements written down, provide them to the vendors and say, I need to see this in your demo. They're going to be giving you a custom demo based on your requirements, but you're buying a piece of software, or at least evaluating a piece of software based on your requirements, not what they're showing you. So, and then the last thing I would say is definitely ask about integrations, right? A lot of people purchase technology today because they think it's the best piece of technology or it looks the best. A lot of people don't use requirements to buy their technology. So in many cases, it's because it was one of the best demos, or it was a palatable price, it was something that they could afford to buy. If you buy a piece of software that does not integrate at all with the existing technology stack that you have, you're the one that's going to integrate it. And that is not your day job. Your day job is servicing your clients, not building integration paradigms. So if that's the case, that it does not integrate, you may want to look elsewhere for another piece of software that may not get you 100% of the way there. Maybe it's only 80%, but trust me, you'll be better off not building those integrations and dealing with the other 20% as either checklists, workflow customizations, something along those lines.
Yeah, no, I'd say integration is absolutely a huge piece that we stress. Other areas, you know, that we're always ensuring when they are deciding on those requirements is the compliance and regulation piece, because sometimes we'll get people presenting solutions to us that are outside of the financial realm, and they may be really good products, you know, for like a realtor or some other industry, but then when you try and bring it into the financial industry, it doesn't make sense. Do they have the same like regulatory aspects or even reporting standards that you have to meet? And knowing that the vendors that you're selecting already meet that helps tremendously in the evaluation process. And then the last two that are probably more obvious, but still get overlooked time to time, is the user experience. So how user-friendly is it, not only for you and your staff, but in engagements like with your clients? Are you actually able to extend that to a client experience so that you're, you know, adding additional value or just replacing the value you had at a previous firm? And then the cost and pricing structure, you touched on that a little, as well as the integration piece, because there are hidden costs. I don't care what vendor out there says that they're fully transparent, but there are always hidden costs. And just understanding what their price model is and that scalability aspect. So if you do grow, like how does that impact you? And just any tiered pricing. So just ensuring that you're discovering kind of all the piece parts that you may end up having to be obligated to. You may not be today, but in the future it could change. So that's, you know, some areas that we are typically having them evaluate, review as part of that, you know, documenting of their requirements before going out and seeing who's even out there.
No, I completely agree. And the pricing is, you know, some vendors will price it by per advisor. Some do by account, some do by client, some do by AUM. Knowing your business going into those kind of negotiations is really important. Great example. I mean, if you have a really large number of accounts that are smaller and they're asking you to price per account, ask them if they'll do advisor-based or client-based or household-based or even AUM-based pricing. You know, ask for a comparison that says, well, I have a ton of small accounts. How is that going to affect me when I grow?
Yeah.
We worked with a practice that was really targeting millennials and Gen Z. Smaller account sizes, right? They're trying to get it by volume. They're building really great relationships with Henrys and super Henrys that at some point will have substantial portfolios, but right now they don't. So understanding that about your business and what your growth strategy is can help you when you're negotiating for your current technology with your current technology vendor or for your next technology stack.
Yeah, I agree. And how much, I guess, weight would you put into the surveys or things that come out of the conferences that we frequently attend or are staples within the industry year in and year out for vendor reputation? So, they are constantly providing feedback from advisors themselves or just industry juggernauts. And so where would you put the weight in those types of surveys or results?
I think that you can put some good stock in those surveys and results, but I think it's directional data. And let me explain the dichotomy that I've just made there. So I think that it's directionally, you're going to get some really good ideas, right? For example, like the T3 survey tells you what are people looking at, right? Not only what their market share is today, but what are people evaluating in the next year. Directionally, I think that's quite good, right? But there's two cautions that I'll make on that. Number one, be careful of herd mentality. Some products demo really well in the end of last conference season, and then they're going to look pretty good about which firms are looking at them. Right? We're going to go evaluate that technology because it looks really good. Doesn't mean that they're buying it. It means they're evaluating it. They're going to review that technology. So be careful of the herd mentality that can come out from some of that data. And then the second caution that I'll make for everyone is, you should always ask for a reference from a technology firm. There is nothing wrong with that. Be wary of the technology firm that cannot provide you with a reference. Now, also go into the reference process eyes open, right? Do not go in and say, show me another firm that's based in the Midwest that has 1.4 to 1.5 billion of assets under management. Do not do that, right? What you want to say is, my requirements from the demo that we gave you, from the requirements we gave you for the demo. I'd like to talk to someone else that has similar requirements. Now what you're doing is you're giving the vendor the opportunity to maybe give you a smaller firm or a larger firm that has similar requirements to you, but they've been successful with it. You don't care about the size because hopefully you want to grow your firm. So you're only that size today. You're not going to be that size tomorrow. So you want to talk to a reference that solved a similar challenge with a similar set of requirements for you. And I think if you go into that process with eyes open and ask for the reference, you'll hopefully have a much, much better experience and you'll feel more confident in making the purchasing decision you're going to make. Without it, there's always Vegas.
Absolutely. Can't go wrong with Vegas.
No. Well, let's we talked a moment ago about integrations, right? And some of the challenges you see with integrations. Why don't we kind of dive a little bit deeper into that? So, recently someone said to me, John, they're integrated with an API, so that must be good, right? Well, maybe. One of the things that people need to realize is an API is an application programming interface. So that means that a programmer can connect the two applications using APIs. Unless you have programmers on staff, you should be asking about what are the out-of-the-box integrations and precisely what data moves across those out-of-the-box integrations. So understanding what actually goes across, for example, in many cases, we find people will ask, well, I would like my investment management solution or my CRM to feed the current positions of a client into financial planning so that I can use that to iterate on the financial plan. That's a really solid question, and you should ask that question. Because today you're probably swivel chairing. You're probably looking over here and then looking at another screen and copying and pasting that data. So That's the real challenges you're trying to solve. And I would ask in depth, look, help me to understand that integration. Do not accept an answer where they say, application A is integrated with application B. Ask, can you explain that to me? What data do you send from A to B? Does anything go from B to A? Or is it a one-way integration? Those are questions that I think will put you in a much better position as you're making your decision. And then finally, understand from them who supports the integration. Does the vendor support it? Do I have to support it? What happens when it breaks? Who do I call? So understanding the direction of that integration, the CRM pushes to financial planning. If the CRM doesn't push to financial planning, I need to call the CRM. If it made the push, but it never got into financial planning, I need to call a financial planning vendor. So you've got to understand that direction, just so you know who to call. Even to come back to what we talked about before, disaster recovery plan.
Yeah.
How do you know who to call? You need to understand some of those integration directions.
Yeah, well, not only the directional aspect, but even frequency, because some of the vendors that we've worked with or even helped with those integrations and the back-end API connection aspects, the calls to those systems, if it is only one way, is it every hour? Is it instantaneous? Is it at the end of the week? Is it at the end of the month? Like, are they batch file uploads? Like, and then yeah, the auditing or I guess credibility of how successful that was is important too, because we've seen it where the integration's there, but maybe only 80% of it got migrated from one app to another. And so, who is responsible for ensuring the integrity of that data being transferred? To your point, like, who do I call? That's the main aspect of the issue. So for us, it's frequency, directional, and responsibility. So
It's really interesting you mentioned that timing too, right? We had a client recently who rang us up and said, look, I'm seeing different numbers in my CRM from my financial plan from the custodian, 3 different sets of numbers. And what we hypothesized with them, and they're going through some testing right now to make sure of this, but I'm pretty sure this is probably what's happening. What they're getting from their custodian to their CRM is a start of day file. And then what's happening is they're getting an end of day between the custodian and the financial planning application. Or one of the things that I think they're doing is they're taking the data out of the CRM and pushing it into financial planning. So what's happening is CRM is being updated multiple times a day. I cut it across to financial planning, and if I look towards the end of the day, I'm going to see it if the market's moved. I'll see different sets of numbers in financial planning from what I'm seeing in my CRM, which could be different sets of numbers from what I saw in my custodian, depending on the timings of the files. So, you mentioned before the hidden costs of some of these implementations. Don't underestimate sometimes the troubleshooting costs you're going to have trying to figure that out with your staff, right? And quite frankly, again, having a good set of requirements, understanding how those integrations work, understanding the timing of those is going to give you enough knowledge that if something does not work properly, you'll know where to at least go and figure that out. Otherwise, you're kind of stumbling in the dark with no lights on.
Yeah, and we've touched on it a number of times, that disaster recovery piece, but we haven't fully touched on the redundancy piece point, in that there's going to be uptime and there's always going to be downtime. I know in all of our conversations, it's technology and something's bound to happen and something's bound to go wrong, but what happens when that occurs? And so, what are they guaranteeing their uptime is? And if they can't guarantee uptime, is there redundancy aspects in place, or how can you get to the info if you have the whole system down and you're locked out? How is your business still going to run? So the disaster recovery piece is important, but then just ensuring even the uptime, or is there an alternative for you to access things if, like, the web portal's down?
No, that's a great point. A lot of times I don't think people take that into account. So they don't have really a disaster recovery plan, or they don't know how they're going to run the business without that. it being in place. You know, it's funny you mentioned too, you know, it's technology, right? So one of the things that we say when you're going to implement your tech stack is expect challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, you should have some sort of project manager that's going to be managing the implementation. Especially if you got multiple principals in the firm, they've got to be able to come to one person and go, where are we on this project, right?
Yep.
And that one person needs to, if nothing else, be the air traffic controller that can connect your service providers that are implementing this with the team internally that's the subject matter expertise on some of these pieces of or at least on your business process and your data. So having someone in that project manager role is critical. And then expect challenges. It's technology. It's going to break. It's not, will it break? It's going to break at some point. And you've got to make sure that you've got that in your plan, right? I can't tell you how many times people will reach out to us and say, my contract with so-and-so is coming up for renewal in 3 months. I need to get off that software. That's not necessarily going to be possible without a real, because you've got to still run your day job as your advisory firm. That's really not going to be possible in some cases. So plan accordingly and make sure that in your plan, you've got enough time around some of those challenges.
Yeah, so you're speaking to the timing aspect, and we get that question quite a bit. I think my favorite is, with the clients who, give us the call that they're moving, and hey, we're moving next week or we're moving next month, and you're like, cool. I can't wait to dig in on this. So let's roll up all of our sleeves here and let's get to work, because this is now going to be work. So for the timeline aspect and just making sure people mentally are going to be able to digest the whole process, where do you see that starting? Is it 6 months? Is it 3 months? Like, where do you find the most comfortable timeline from your perspective?
I think it depends. And let me explain my answer there for a moment. Let's take as a good example financial planning, right? Financial planning, if you've got a financial plan in one system, there is no system that will enable portability to another financial planning tool, okay? So you can stand up a new financial planning solution normally in about 2 to 3 months, right? You've got market assumptions that you've got to be able to agree upon and make sure that that's there. You're going to format what your financial plan is going to look like. So there's configuration settings. You can get through that in about 2 to 3 months. Probably more towards 3 months in a lot of firms that we work with. So, but let's just say 3 months for a moment. That's standing it up new. That means all your new financial plans in 3 months will now be done in System B. You still got to get the stuff out of System A. That may take a lot longer, right? So what we find a lot of times is firms will say, well, I'm going to move to System B. When can I turn this off? When do you want to have all your data out of there? How do we want to do that? With a financial plan, you can export the financial plans to PDF, import them into a document storage facility, or import them into a CRM maybe, and as an attachment to the client record, and you're good to go, right? If you have, we had one firm that we worked with, they're like, I want to turn this off in 2 months. We said, go get 3 summer interns. And all they're going to do for 8 hours a day is export financial plans and then import them into your CRM. And you'll be fine. You'll be able to pull that off. Don't underestimate that level of effort, right? And get the appropriate staffing level to do that. In the case of, like I was saying, export financial plans as PDFs and import them someplace else, that's perfect to be able to use a temporary person or maybe a college intern or someone along those lines, as opposed to turning to your financial planner and saying, I need you to export these financial plans and import them over here. That's a complete waste of their ability at that point. So pick the right resource for the right time. So you can do things like that really easily, because that's an easy piece of software to say, I'm going to stand it up. Everything new happens over here. We're good to go. CRM systems, not so much, because you've got to be able to have the data over there to be able to do it. Migrating data for a CRM could take 2 months alone just to export the data and migrate it. And that's if your data is clean. If it's not, expect you're going to do an export. You're going to look at the data to figure out everything that's dirty, go fix all that, and then re-export or import the data with the new fixes. That could take some time. You know, depending on how dirty your data is, it could take some time. So I think a lot of times if you have an idea that you want to move from a system, my recommendation would be 6 months before you want to move, start evaluating what your new application is going to be, how do you get that new application stood up, and what your time frame is. We have a firm right now that they want to move off an application. They spoke with us. We said do a 1-year extension for application A, and that will give you enough time to be able to basically plan this, get it done, and move to application B. You'll probably double pay for a quarter on application A because they're not going to let you break the contract. So you'll probably double pay, but you'll be up and running on application B with no challenges. And you've got that cushion. Without that, it's, like you said, it's a lot of work. Roll up your sleeves. It's not 9 to 5 anymore. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, and I want to throw an asterisk on one of the things you said is that's if you have clean data. I don't think I've ever seen anyone with clean data, so let's just assume no one has actually clean data.
We've met a lot of firms that think their data is clean until we export the data and say, so what do we want to do with this? Yeah, I think anyone that's had an application in production for a period of time has got bad data, right? It's a fact of life. It's cost prohibitive to keep your data completely clean all the time. So in a lot of cases, again, coming back to that CRM, right? We worked with one firm that had 30,000 names in their CRM that were leads that had been out there. Some of these leads haven't been touched in 5 or 6 years. So we said, look, if you haven't touched the lead in 6 months, just prune it. We can prune it, by the way, by getting the name and email address and adding that to a marketing capability for your newsletter. That's fine. But to pay to migrate that data across, you're just migrating garbage from one system to another, and you're paying to do it. So it's much more cost effective for you to take that data, prune it, upload it into a newsletter, forget whatever else was associated with that record, because it's old and it's probably not good. In that particular case, by the way, we went to import about 26,000 contacts into their email system that they were creating, which was Constant Contact. When we uploaded it, over 8,500 of them were bad emails, which means the person had changed jobs in the time that they were, the lead had changed jobs, or the email got shut off, or what have you. So those leads, you would never be able to contact them anyway. If you would have moved them from CRM A to CRM B, you would have just moved junk. There was no way that you would ever contact those people.
Yeah, that's a very interesting and valid point that I think gets overlooked in the data management aspect. And we briefly touched on the avoiding scope creep, but I want to circle back to that a little bit in the realm of out of the box applications and software and things. Where do you see people more times than not getting stuck on the scope creep, or purchasing something that they gave you all the bells and whistle, demo, but that's this and you bought this? Speak to me or the audience on kind of what that looks like from your perspective and how to avoid that.
A lot of times I like to think of scope creep where you're dealing with this special snowflake. And let me give you that analogy for a minute. So in a lot of cases, the scope creep occurs because you've got the business process works for 80% of the firm, but there's this one set of advisors, or there's this one advisor, or there's this one team that are a little bit different, right? So trying to have all of the what ifs to accommodate that one team, that's where you see a lot of scope creep, right? That happens a lot. And what I like to say is, look, if you're trying to make sure you have a nice meadow full of snow, avoid getting focused too much on one special snowflake, because you're going to lose perspective of what do we need to do to make this project successful, right? Claim victory. They may be slightly unhappy for a little while, but claim victory and make that a day 2 item, where you'll establish that special snowflake. Also, you know, you may find that once this is in production and that special team is using it, that might be good enough for them. And they actually don't need the special snowflake. So you've avoided all the costs associated with trying to do that by just simply giving a base model, if you will. And I think that works very well across all of your implementation. Try to stick to the requirements. This is what we're going to do to be successful. Deliver that. Once you've delivered that, anything new that comes up, track that as a day 2 item and just keep it on a day 2 list. Claim victory on your first implementation, and then you can rinse and repeat and start the whole thing with day 2 items, get requirements on day 2 items, and kind of rinse and repeat the whole process. But definitely focus on delivering what you said you were going to deliver first, capture anything that's special outside of your initial scope as a day 2 item, and then come back to that after you've claimed victory on the project. You'll be much better off, and you'll have a much higher level of adoption throughout the firm, because everyone's going to look at it and go, oh, so we're done. So this is what we're going to use? Yes. And then you can capture, you know, new requirements or issues that maybe you didn't have in your initial requirements after that.
I couldn't agree more. I think the narrowing the focus for achieving the goals is probably the first piece of advice that I think every practice should follow. Otherwise, you know, it's what can you accomplish with narrow focus and what can you accomplish if you're focusing on 5 to 6 different things. It's going to be a longer timeline and probably less adoption or agreements on, you know, path forward. There'd be a lot more maybe turmoil or unrest, so to speak, in the day-to-day operations because there's no clear goal.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, claim victory, go to day 2.
Excellent. Well, you know, I know we have about 10 to 12 minutes or so, so I don't know if we want to open it up to questions from the audience and bring it home here, or if you have any last piece of words of wisdom before we go to that, John.
Let's see if there are any questions from the audience.
Okay, I got a couple. Let me start with this one. You talked about having a disaster recovery plan as a blind spot when creating tech stacks. What other big blind spots can you tell us about that might not have been covered?
Do you want to hit that first? Or do you want me to go first?
Kick it off. You're the guest of honor.
So some of the other blind spots that I think you'd have, not just a disaster recovery plan, but we talked a little bit. Well, let me kind of recap a couple of that we talked about, and then I'll add 1 or 2 more. So understanding the integration capability, that's definitely a blind spot. People take stock very too often in the fact that they've got, you know, because it says it's integrated, they just say, oh, we're integrated, no problem, everything's good to go. That's challenging. Avoid that. Make sure that you don't get caught in that position. Next is around the tech stack itself. Make sure that that what you've got in your tech stack all talk to one another, that it's going to fit. Another big blind spot, not understanding how you're going to implement your workflows within the product, right? Assuming that the product is just going to handle your workflows and not understanding what it's going to take for you to configure those workflows within the product is challenging. Definitely ask questions around that and make sure you've got a really solid idea of how is this going to work moving forward? Can I implement my workflows in this? And if you remember, I made a point where I said, there's at some point where you're getting to the end of your CRM workflows, and then for account opening, that's going to happen in a different piece of software. Too many times people assume that all their workflows are going to be in one piece of software. Don't assume that, because in all likelihood, they're not going to be in one piece of software. And then the last gotcha that I'll highlight is checklists are really important for you to be able to track. So make sure you've got checklists for things like gathering information to create the financial plan, account opening information, right? the household information, beneficiary information, all of the items that you're going to need to really open the account correctly the first time, make sure you're capturing that up front. I've run into a lot of firms that open accounts and then handle the beneficiaries later. That may or may not work for your client experience.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, it's areas we have briefly touched on throughout this webinar, but I think scalability is a big blind spot. A lot of people may find what is working for their requirements today, or they'll just define their requirements today, but not necessarily what they want their requirements to be, a year from now or 2 years from now. So not planning for the growth. So just ensuring that when you are setting those requirements up front, that you're allowing yourself to understand the direction you want to scale. It may change over time, but at least knowing that you have a plan past, 6 months to a year. So I feel like that's a big one. Not so luxurious blind spot is probably more data security. There's a lot of firms out there, and just ensuring you've done your due diligence on what they have in place for their own data security, and making sure that they're following the proper measures, protocols, and things. That's not the sexy one out there, but that I think is a big one. And then even just the hidden costs. I've touched on that a number of times, but there's so many times that I've seen people overbuy, or they look at applications and they buy something that, you get XYZ out of the box, but then there's the customization piece and what you have to do to get what you want from a requirement standpoint ends up costing you way more than it should in the long run. And so for me, I'd say those are kind of the main ones that we haven't really touched on, or John didn't really connect on in his answer, but there's so many things that just by asking your peers or asking, people like us to make sure that you are understanding what those blind spots are and understanding what decisions you have to make can save a lot of trouble down the line.
Okay, good answers. I have one here that says, John, you talked about requirements for tech demos. How do I identify those?
I would say the first thing you want to do is take a look at your requirements in the form of like a Moscow list. Moscow list is a must-have, should have, could have, and won't have, right? So understanding what you must have to be successful is really critical. Should haves are, it would be great if they have this capability, but it might not be a day one item, but it would give them extra points on their test if they had this. Could have are, it's not going to change my business one way or another, but they might have some of these capabilities. And then a won't have is, I'm just not going to use this. I don't need it, so I shouldn't be looking at it, right? I'll give you a really concrete example of that. We have a client that we work with that is, many of their clients are wealthy and they're going into their distribution years, right? Income planning, pretty important for them, really important for them. So they must have income planning capability, right? Tax planning, they're wealthy clients. They're not doing as much tax planning. So a could have would be tax planning capability, right? These folks, this particular firm works with they partner with an attorney for estate planning. It could have estate planning capability, but I kind of outsource that. So if it does, great. And if it doesn't, I don't, not something I'm worried about. And then won't have, they because they're dealing primarily with wealthy clients, they're not really interested in things like Social Security timing, right? So that's something they're like, even if they have it, I'm not going to use it. So that's a won't have. So just in a financial planning, that's like a small example based on your client base of how you may want to put together a Moscow list. Set up your requirements that way, and you're going to have a very, very good demo. Or the vendor will give you a very bad demo because they don't have the capability that you really need.
All right, anything from you, Danielle?
No, I hit the nail on the head there. I think, you can pretty much evaluate right out the gate if the demo is going to be a successful one or not. just based off of kind of what they're presenting to you. You evaluate that by, are they trying to sell you past your requirements, or like, almost pigeonhole you into something rather than addressing your actual concerns. I think that's the probably easiest way to ensure you're with the proper vendor.
All right. I've got one more question. We've got a little bit of time, but it's an easy one. How often do I need to audit my tech stack?
I would audit your tech stack. I would say audit your tech stack once a year. And the reason I say that is pricing, we're in an industry right now where, and Danielle pointed this out earlier, right? If you just look at the RIA space, there's over 400 different vendors. Here at the Oasis Group, because we work with broker dealers and asset managers as well, we track over 500 different pieces of technology, right? So we're not seeing a lot of M&A in the technology space within wealth management right now. We've seen a little bit with Orion and Investnet, but for the most part, there's still a lot of really new technologies that are coming out that are very interesting that you may or may not be able to use in your practice, right? So I do think on an annual basis, you should be looking at what's out there. Does what I have really fit my needs, or should I be looking at something else? Especially because for the 6 core pieces of technology we talked about, CRM, financial planning, investment management, those core pieces of technology are not flipping a light switch to move from one tech platform to another. So if you look every year and then 1 year you turn around and say, I may want to go look at what else is out there, maybe this doesn't fit my needs anymore, or maybe I've outgrown this piece of software. By the time you evaluate the alternatives, get together a project plan, budget that, and start doing the migration, you may take a year to do that, depending on how fast your firm moves. So I think because of the amount of new technology we're seeing in this space, the explosion of the capabilities we've seen, and the lack of M&A, annualized reviews are probably in your best interest.
And I couldn't agree more. I think just in the world of technology, if you're not evaluating, like, you're already behind the 8 ball. And I think, even just a perfect example is in just our day-to-day lives, not even just our work lives, but like, the iPhone was invented just under 2 decades ago. So it's like, look how far we've come, and just that evolution of just your own personal use. And when there's companies purely dedicated to enhancing, and that's their, livelihood themselves, you can assure that there's going to be constant innovation and new things coming out year after year after year. And you'll see that at the conferences with all the new vendors, new names, new competition out there. It's unreal how heavy the competition is in the ecosystem. And it's good for the industry. I mean, it's making it so that people aren't stagnant, and making sure that they're putting their best foot forward all the time.
And I will, just one last point on this that I'll make is, when you go to look at your technology stack, don't look at by application, look by your business process. Your technology is supposed to be a force multiplier for your business, not what tells you how your business is supposed to run. There's a really big difference in that, although it may seem subtle. So like with the Oasis Group, when we approach a technology assessment, we do that in about 8 weeks. And we look at from lead to annual meeting, what does your business process look like? And then how does your technology support that business process? That's what you should be evaluating, especially if you're a registered investment advisor. Your bread and butter is differentiating yourself from your 38,000 friends that are other registered investment advisors. If you're trying to use the same software as everybody else in the same way as everybody else, you're probably not getting that differentiation that you really want. So if you're going to evaluate your tech software, whether you bring on a firm like us or Myriad or anyone else, use your business process as your guide, and then figure out how does your technology support that. That's what's going to help you to have your business process continue to be your differentiator, and your technology either support it or force multiply your process, not the other way around.
Well said. Okay, well, that's all the time that we have for questions, but if you have any follow-up questions, you can connect with Danielle and John on LinkedIn. And thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to John and Danielle for being on with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. It's always good to have a conversation with you, John, and looking forward to the next one.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye everybody.
Bye-bye.